Under the scorching sun of the American West, a single mother held her 8-year-old son close as he gasped for breath on the side of the road. They had just been beaten and thrown out like trash by her husband's family. No one stopped. No one cared. Death was just a heartbeat away. But then, a stranger pulled over and said, "Some people die in the shade. Others survive as if they're burning alive under the sun." Along a deserted stretch of federal highway in the American West, no gas stations, no homes in sight. Under the most unforgiving summer heat, a mother and her child lay collapsed by the roadside. No one stopped. No one turned around. Only the wind stirred the red dust, and a cry for help, faint as a whisper, lost in the sand. The western sun bore down like punishment. Temperatures soared above 100 degrees Fahrenheit, melting the asphalt beneath every passing tire. No shade, no awning, just dirt, gravel, and dry winds whipping up the dust. On the side of a quiet back road leading from the Whitmore estate to the highway, far from any main neighborhood, Clara Bennett lay slumped on the ground with her son. Her cotton dress was torn at the knees, her hair matted, sunburned skin peeling. Blood speckled her forehead. She clutched tightly to 8-year-old Elliot, who lay unconscious, his arms swollen and dried with blood. Beside them sat a tattered cloth bag and a nearly empty bottle of water. No ambulance, no phone, no one passed by. Only the hum of cicadas and the kind of heat that steals your breath. Clara whispered, her voice cracked and fading. "Elliot, wake up. Please don't scare me. I'm begging you." He didn't respond. His lips were blue. His little hand still clutched the hem of her dress. Like somewhere deep inside, he still held on to hope. From behind a wrought iron fence, through the tinted glass of the Whitmore estate's first-floor parlor, Beatrice Whitmore stood watching, childhood friend of the late Charles Whitmore, the man whose family had treated her like their own. She wore a spotless white dress and held a glass of iced tea. Her expression was neither angry nor sympathetic, just cold, like the ice clinking in her glass. "She doesn't belong here anymore," a man's voice said from behind the glass. It was Percy Langston, Charles's closest friend and the Whitmore family's financial advisor, not far beyond the automatic gate that had just locked shut. Clara sat on the curb, holding her child. She didn't look up. She just held her son tighter, as if afraid he might vanish from her arms too. On the scorched ground, with cicadas crying like broken violins, her heart trembled for the one thing she still had left: Elliot. Everything else, the accusations, the judgment, the mansion at her back, meant nothing now. If she could save her son, she could endure anything. And just when all hope had shriveled, crushed by cruelty and silence, a vehicle slowed to a stop. The story, from that moment, veered in a different direction, not because of a miracle, but because one stranger decided to stop. The engine rattled under the blistering sun. A dusty, silver-grey Ford F-150 slowly rolled to a stop on the side of the road. The man behind the wheel rolled down the window, squinting into the heat. He didn't stop out of pity, but because something deep inside his chest tightened. A memory. Silas Whitmore, 41, was a reclusive millionaire. He owned hundreds of acres of farmland and held stakes in several major agricultural firms in the West. After losing his wife and daughter in a house fire, he withdrew from society, choosing a life of solitude on a remote ranch at the edge of town. He avoided people and questions. Then he saw her, a woman, exhausted, cradling an unconscious child. Her eyes met his, wary, fierce, unyielding. She looked like a wounded mother wolf, ready to bite anyone who came too close. Silas stepped out of the truck, keeping a respectful distance. He crouched slightly, not moving in, his voice calm and honest. "The boy's got a fever. I have water. And a truck. Let me help." Clara looked up, her gaze wavering. She didn't have the strength to resist anymore, not because she trusted him, but because she had no other choice. Her hand still clutched her son, but this time, she didn't pull away. "I won't touch either of you," Silas said, "but he's burning up. I've got water, I've got a truck, and I know a doctor. Let me take you." He didn't step closer. Instead, he opened a bottle of water, set it on the ground a few feet away, then backed up. The gesture caught Clara off guard. No one from the Whitmore estate had ever done anything like that. No one had ever even asked. Clara glanced down at Elliot, his lips cracked, his breathing shallow. She knew. If they waited a minute longer, she could lose him. Tears welled in her eyes. And then she nodded. It was not a nod of trust. It was a nod of surrender. Inside the truck, plain interior, the smell of old leather and antiseptic. Elliot lay limp on the back seat. Clara cradled his head in her lap, gently dabbing his sweat with a wet cloth Silas had given her. She didn't say a word. She didn't ask his name. In the rearview mirror, Silas watched the boy and his mother blur in and out of the reflection. A memory surfaced, his daughter's eyes in the middle of thick, choking smoke. "The town clinic's closed this afternoon," he said quietly. "But I know someone, a retired army medic. He'll come." Clara remained silent, but this time there was no fear in her eyes, just exhaustion, and something faint, but real. Gratitude. The truck turned onto a dusty road that wound up a hill. The scent of dry grass mingled with the distant sound of horses, like the threshold to a world untouched, quiet, unaccustomed to strangers. The ranch appeared, white wooden fences, a 3-story brick house aged with time, yet proud and well kept. A century old, but still standing strong. Clara awoke in the truck's passenger seat, dazed and groggy. Realizing she was no longer on the roadside, panic surged. "Where's Elliot?" she gasped. "In the back room, safe, being looked after," came Silas's voice from the kitchen. She rushed to the wooden guest room and found Elliot lying in bed. A damp cloth rested on his forehead, his arm bandaged. On the nightstand, a glass of water and a handwritten note. "Rest. Don't worry." Clara stood still, stunned. No one had ever been gentle with her like this. Not with words, not with questions. Just respect. She backed up, leaned against the wall, and slid down to the floor. For the first time in months, she let herself breathe. In the kitchen, Silas stood alone. He wasn't the kind of man used to caring for others, but from the window, he saw it all. How Clara wiped her son's forehead, changed the cloth, broke up the pills like she was holding on to the entire world. Not everyone could mother like that. He poured another glass of water, then turned away. But something inside him had shifted. He didn't even know her full name. But maybe, just maybe, fate was arranging something neither of them saw coming. After all, saving someone from the sun doesn't mean you've healed what's already burned inside them. And inside that quiet house, long-buried memories were beginning to stir. And not all of them were gentle. Silas felt a tightness in his throat. A dull ache settled in his chest. It had been a long time since he allowed himself to remember. Night fell over the hillside ranch, the silence broken only by the chirping of crickets and the wind rustling through wooden shutters. In the small room, Elliot remained feverish. Clara sat beside him, hands trembling as she changed the cool cloth on his forehead, her eyes shadowed with worry and exhaustion. She had lost count of how many times she had cried since waking, but she knew that if Elliot didn't pull through, she wouldn't either. At the doorway, Silas stood silently. The scene before him was hauntingly familiar, a mother refusing to leave her child's side despite her own fatigue. Clara glanced around. The house was spacious, yet empty, save for a single polished photo frame on the shelf, meticulously maintained. It held the image of a gentle-looking brunette woman and a little girl clutching a teddy bear. That same bear now sat quietly on a nearby chair, worn and faded. Clara turned to Silas, her voice subdued. "I saw the photo of your family. Your wife and daughter are beautiful. Would they mind if my son and I stayed here tonight? I can leave immediately if they would." Silas replied slowly, avoiding her gaze. "I lived with my wife and daughter, but they passed away after a house fire. They were rescued, but the burns and smoke inhalation were too severe. They didn't survive." As Clara inquired about his solitary life, memories surged back, vivid and painful, as if they had happened yesterday. That day, flames engulfed the wooden house, casting an orange-red glow. Silas screamed their names as firefighters held him back. A fire blanket covered a severely burned body being rushed into an ambulance. Inside, Emily, his wife, was still conscious, weakly grasping his hand. "If you love me, find a good woman. Let her take care of you." The emergency room doors closed. Despite exhaustive treatment by top medical professionals, they passed away a few days later, leaving Silas alone on the ranch with a void nothing could fill. Clara remained silent. She said nothing, only turned away, gently squeezing her son's hand. But her eyes had changed, no longer wary, no longer fearful. Instead, they held genuine empathy. A knock at the door pulled Silas back to the present. An older man entered, medical bag in hand. It was Doc Horace Avery, a retired army medic who had cared for Silas's wife and daughter in their final days. He examined Elliot efficiently, nodding in approval at Clara's care. Turning to her, his gaze softened. "You've done well. The boy will be fine. Thanks to you, he stayed conscious this long." Clara bowed her head, swallowing the gratitude that caught in her throat. Doc Avery stepped into the hallway where Silas stood, hands in his pockets, eyes fixed on the darkness beyond the window. "You know," he began, "when you called, I thought it was about a horse in labor. I didn't expect a woman. And a child." Silas didn't respond. Doc Avery approached, his voice deeper. "I saw you nearly die with them, Emily and little Annie, but now I see you truly breathing for the first time since then." Silas tightened his grip on his coat, his voice hoarse. "I don't know what to do with this. I wasn't looking for it." Doc Avery placed a firm hand on Silas's shoulder, his gaze unwavering. "She's not here to replace anyone. She's here to bring the human part of you back to life. If you let the past drag you down again, this time, no one will be able to pull you out." Silas looked back at the open doorway, where Clara sat, head resting on the bed, still holding her son's hand. It had been a long time since his house echoed with human voices, but for the first time, it didn't feel intrusive. It was silent, enough for emotions within him to stir. Fire can consume everything, but some memories and feelings never burn away. No one knows when wounds truly heal, but a home filled with voices, the footsteps of children, that's where the cracks begin to mend, quietly, slowly, but genuinely. Sunlight streamed through the thin curtains, casting a warm glow on the aged furnishings Clara had never dared to touch before. On the nightstand, a dust-covered photo frame depicted a family of 3. Nearby, a faded teddy bear rested on an old armchair, a silent witness to the child who once played there. Clara stepped out of the room, careful not to wake her son. Barefoot on the cool wooden floor, she quietly observed the house, tidy yet devoid of life. Each photo, each faint chalk mark on the wall seemed to cling to a world that had long since fallen silent. In the kitchen, Silas was brewing coffee. The rich aroma filled the still air. He heard Clara's footsteps, but didn't turn around, instead gesturing toward the hot water kettle and a loaf of bread on the table. "Coffee's ready. Eggs are in the oven. Help yourself." Clara paused, then nodded slightly. She wasn't used to being treated as a person, let alone as a guest. She selected an old mug, poured herself some coffee, and quietly sat across from him, maintaining a respectful distance, yet the atmosphere felt less strained. An unexpected visitor. By midday, Mildred McLean arrived. The sheriff's wife, a woman in her 40s with a sturdy build and kind eyes, had once been a nurse at the town hospital. She didn't come empty-handed. She brought a basket filled with homemade pastries, freshly picked apples from her backyard, a jar of her own honey, and a heart seasoned with experience and free of judgment. Mildred knocked gently twice before letting herself in, as if she knew her presence wouldn't be unwelcome. Clara, caught off guard, quickly wiped her hands on her apron, but Mildred simply smiled. "I heard we have new folks around. Not here to pry. Just thought. In this town, when someone starts anew, they shouldn't feel like a burden." Clara moved, bowed her head. Mildred placed the basket on the table and sat beside her without waiting for an invitation. She poured tea into 2 chipped porcelain cups and spoke calmly. "I've known Silas since he was clean-shaven. Knew Emily, his wife, and little Annie. My husband and I helped him with the arrangements after they passed. You know, after that day, Silas didn't leave the ranch for a whole year." Clara remained silent, but her eyes slowly met Mildred's. Mildred noticed and nodded gently. Since Emily and Annie's passing, Silas hasn't let any unfamiliar woman into this house. No one had the patience or gentleness to make him open the door. But you're different. You stayed. Not out of curiosity, not out of pity. Maybe to outsiders, it's just a coincidence. But to me it's a sign. Even a flicker of hope amidst the flames he's been trapped in for 6 years. Clara clenched her hands in her lap, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm grateful to him. But I don't think I'm anyone special. I'm just trying to survive." Mildred smiled warmly, her eyes gentle. Sometimes it's those who don't see themselves as special who help others find a reason to keep going. They sat together, sipping tea in the old kitchen, one with a heart once shattered, the other still piecing hers back together. Nothing was certain, but for the first time, Clara felt her presence wasn't a burden. A new routine. 3 weeks had passed since Clara and her son had taken refuge at the ranch. No formal agreements were made, but shared meals, laundry cycles, and towels drying on the porch transformed their temporary stay into something more permanent. Silas opened the barn door and slowly stepped into the yard. Clara walked beside him, her hands still dusted with flour. They didn't smile, but their steps felt lighter. The evening sun cast a golden hue over the old barn roof. The scent of hay mingled with the creaking of wooden beams and the rhythmic clatter of horse hooves, a familiar melody. Silas pointed to a small saddle hanging by the barn. Annie loved riding the little horse. She called Daisy her best friend. Every time she rode, she'd shout, "I'm going to be a cowboy like Daddy." Clara chuckled, then paused. She glanced at him and noticed a child's cowboy hat, faded and worn, hanging on a wooden peg by the fence. Silas spoke softly. "I haven't shared that with anyone in 6 years. You're the first." Clara didn't respond. But in that silence, Silas felt something he hadn't in a long time. Safety, the comfort of being trusted without the need for explanations. Over the days, both Clara and Silas began to change, though neither said it aloud. Clara became less reserved, her smile returning each morning as she watched Elliot play in the yard. Her wounds hadn't fully healed, but they were beginning to scab over. Silas, once a shadow of a man, started to open up. For the first time in 6 years, he recounted simple memories of Emily and little Annie. He spoke slowly, as if relearning how to share, how to name his grief. Clara listened. She didn't interrupt or offer pity, just genuine empathy. She had heard from Mildred about Silas's pain, but now, hearing it from him, she truly grasped its depth. Living with Clara and Elliot, Silas began to rediscover the essence of family. The house, once silent, now echoed with voices and laughter. The kitchen warmed with bubbling soups and the aroma of baked goods. The dining table, long unused, now held meals and conversations. They stood together amidst the whispering grass and under the crimson sunset. They didn't speak of their sorrows, but both were gradually opening their hearts. And in that moment, Silas realized he was no longer living solely in the past. They didn't label it love. No one dared to use that word. But their daily presence in each other's lives began to soften the hardened memories. And slowly, their hearts learned to trust once more. Clara began staying longer than she had initially planned. Though she never said it aloud, her actions spoke volumes. Each morning, she taught Elliot his letters, did the laundry, cooked meals, mended old clothes, and cleaned corners of the farmhouse that had long been forgotten. Ruby May, the 17-year-old neighbor who often tended the garden, started dropping by more frequently. She helped Clara water the plants and played with Elliot as he slowly regained his emotional footing. Mildred visited weekly, bringing homemade bread and sharing warm, meandering stories. One afternoon, during lunch in the cozy wooden kitchen, the room fell silent after Elliot's laughter. Clara was slicing bread and Silas was pouring water when Elliot suddenly asked, "Mr. Silas, could you be my dad?" The room froze. Clara stiffened, quickly set down the knife, and gently stroked her son's head. "Elliot, don't say that, Mr. Silas. He can't." Silas looked up slightly, his eyes still on the glass of water, but Elliot continued, unabashed. "I just want Mom to have someone. A good dad, like Mr. Silas. He's not mean. He doesn't make Mom cry like Dad Charles did." Clara turned to her son, eyes brimming with tears. She hadn't realized how closely her little boy had been watching her. "You don't like Dad Charles?" Elliot nodded. "I just don't want Mom to hurt anymore. I know she still cries at night. I just want someone to make her smile, like when she talks to Mr. Silas." Silas heard every word. He stood up, gently took Elliot's hand, and led him to the coloring table near the window. "There's better light over here. Go ahead and color. Later, Dad will help you draw a horse, okay?" It wasn't a formal agreement, but the way Silas referred to himself as Dad made Elliot's heart soar. The boy couldn't hide his joyful smile, his eyes sparkling as if he'd discovered something magical. "Dad! Now I have a dad! And he's the best." Clara, flustered, was about to correct him when Silas returned, still smiling. She murmured, "I'm sorry. He didn't mean to." But Silas gently interrupted, "It's okay. I'm glad he sees that in me." His gentle smile showed no discomfort. Clara remained silent, but something within her softened. Clara stayed seated, tears quietly falling onto her hands. Silas returned, poured her another glass of water, and for the first time he asked, "You've never told me. What happened? Why were you and your son lying by the roadside that day?" Clara looked into his eyes. Silas spoke slowly, his voice calm, but not pressing. "If you're not ready, you can tell me another time. But if today is the day, I'm here to listen." Clara took a deep breath. Then she began to speak. Her story unfolded in fragments, like a dull blade reopening an old wound. She spoke of Charles, a cruel husband who manipulated finances, inflicted emotional abuse, and abandoned her after taking everything. Their marriage lacked love. It was a prestigious transaction where she was treated as a bridal asset, living in a luxurious mansion, but crying silently on the bathroom floor each night. She recounted the car accident, that day when Charles called her, threatening her while intoxicated and out of control. His family blamed her, claiming the call unsettled him. But in truth, he was speeding while arguing with his mistress via Bluetooth, a device found in the car, but later quietly removed from the investigation records. Charles's family, led by Beatrice, publicly defamed her in local media, crafting a narrative that she caused his death. They painted her as a cold-hearted, unfaithful wife, waiting for her husband's demise to claim his assets. No one mentioned the dashcam recording, something Clara never saw, nor was it included in official files. A close neighbor later whispered to her that the footage showed Charles driving while arguing intensely with a woman over the phone, and that Percy's associates had swapped out the Bluetooth device before the police arrived. Clara clenched her fists, then looked up at Silas, her eyes filled with tears, but her voice steady. "I'm not perfect, but I've never harmed anyone." Silas sat beside her, his gaze unwavering, like a witness, not a judge. Clara continued, her voice softer, as if speaking to him and to herself after years of silence. "That day, Beatrice summoned me for a final resolution. She said if I didn't sign away all custody rights to Elliot, she'd teach me one last lesson." Her voice faltered. After a pause, she exhaled and went on. "They dragged me out of the car. Elliot was shoved, his arm hitting a rock. I don't know what else they planned. I just know that once they left, I grabbed my son and ran. No time to take anything. I thought if we ran far enough, fast enough. But we collapsed just outside their neighborhood, under the scorching sun. No one helped. No one opened their door." A long silence followed. Clara wiped her tears and bowed her head. "And then, you came. Not with noise, not with pity, just asking, 'Do you need help?'" Silas blinked, realizing for the first time that their meeting wasn't mere chance. It was a fateful moment, where a man who had lost everything found someone losing hope. And he chose not to turn away. Clara pressed her lips together. "I'm not grateful to you for saving me. I'm grateful because you saw me as a person, not as a shadow tainted by scandal. And that saved me from disappearing entirely." Silas listened quietly. He didn't interrupt. He didn't offer comfort. He just sat beside her, like a silent mirror reflecting what the world had overlooked. In the simple wooden kitchen, the afternoon sun streamed through the window, casting light on the table still bearing crumbs of bread and a glass of water. Clara rested her head on her arm, tears falling onto her dry wrist. But her voice didn't waver. For the first time, someone truly wanted to know. "And you, the one listening, are you pausing for a moment? Where do you come from? From a peaceful town? Or from a bustling city corner amidst the chaos? Or perhaps somewhere even farther? What are you feeling inside? An old wound resurfacing? A loved one who left? Or just the unexpected realization that you've experienced moments like Clara's, misunderstood, pushed to the edge, without anyone asking, 'What happened to you?' If you can, take a moment to share what you're thinking, feeling, or what you'd like to say to Clara, if she were your friend in real life." Beatrice Whitmore, after weeks of silence, reappeared in town. With her usual nonchalant tone and ever-present sunglasses, she visited the salon, grocery store, and even the church, leaving behind whispers at each stop. Clara's been staying at Silas's place alone for weeks, using her looks to trap him. Percy Langston didn't stay on the sidelines. He smirked whenever Clara's name came up. Let's not forget she was Charles's wife. Now she shows up just when Silas is vulnerable? You think that's love? It's a setup. The gossip spread quickly. Store clerks began to look at Clara differently. Greetings turned curt or vanished altogether. One day at the pharmacy, the clerk turned away, pretending not to see her. A bakery owner tossed her receipt without making eye contact. Children whispered. Adults avoided her. Someone even posted a sign outside the farm gate. Protect decent men from scheming women. Clara didn't react, but her eyes grew heavier each time she returned home. Elliot started asking why people no longer greeted his mother. Did you do something wrong, Mom? Why does everyone look at you like that? Why won't they sell you bread anymore? Clara squeezed his hand, smiling, but her heart was breaking. She didn't know how to explain that malice doesn't need a reason, just an opportunity. One morning in the small town square bustling with weekend shoppers, Clara took Elliot to buy school supplies. She stepped into the general store cautiously, eyes wary. As usual, whispers began from the corners. But this time, Beatrice Whitmore appeared in a striking red dress, sunglasses on, with a mocking smile. Beatrice approached, blocking Clara's path. This town's small, Clara. Rumors spread faster than the wind. Just a few words, and people will remember who you are. Clara replied calmly, I've never forgotten who I am, but it seems you're afraid people might forget you, so you have to remind them. Beatrice sneered. A dependent, a failure, exploiting a widower's pity. I think I'm being quite objective. Clara looked her straight in the eye. I've never asked for anyone's pity, and if you truly believed you were right, you wouldn't need to speak in public. Beatrice faltered, her smile fading. The surrounding crowd fell silent. Elliot clutched his mother's hand, looking up. Are you okay, Mum? Clara bent down, brushing his hair. I'm okay, because I know I haven't done anything wrong. Beatrice turned away, but her shadow lingered over the tense atmosphere of the market. Clara stepped outside, head held high, not with arrogance or bitterness, but as a mother determined to protect the truth. Finn Morgan, a young journalist from Chicago, known for investigating civil cases, heard about the rumors. He arrived in town with his camera, notebook, and keen journalistic instincts. Finn met with Clara, then Silas. He quietly visited the legal office that once held land transaction records and investments. He uncovered a different truth. Charles Whitmore had conspired with Percy Langston to forge a land transfer, causing Silas to lose over 40 acres of hayfields years ago. Clara had no knowledge of this, but this revelation became the key to clearing her name. Finn didn't stop there. He approached Clara on a drizzly afternoon. In a small, seldom visited cafe at the end of the street, he placed his notebook on the table and asked, I've heard many stories, many rumors, but I don't write based on hearsay. I want to hear the truth, from you. Clara looked at him, surprised. After a moment of silence, she nodded. If my story can help someone else avoid being misunderstood like I was, I'm willing to share. Finn listened attentively. He took notes by hand, without recording, demonstrating his trust. At the end of their conversation, he stood up and shook Clara's hand. Thank you. I won't do this just for an article. I'll see it through to ensure the truth has its place. From that day, Finn was more than a journalist. He was someone piecing together the fragments to find a rightful conclusion to a story distorted by power and prejudice. Clara visited Sheriff Amos McLean, the town's police chief, on a quiet afternoon at the station. She didn't cry or plead. She simply placed a copy of Elliot's medical report, several handwritten accounts of the events, and met his gaze, unafraid, just earnest. She said, I have nothing to lose except my son, and I need you to know the truth. Sheriff Amos McLean over 50, tall, with a deep voice and seasoned eyes, initially didn't fully believe Clara's account. He had known Charles, had trusted the narratives Beatrice and Percy presented. He had received complaints from townspeople, mostly loyal to the old Whitmore family, about suspicious activities at Silas's farm. Amos hesitated. He knew Silas was a reserved man, but had no blemishes. Clara was just a woman abandoned by her husband. Her past made him uncertain. Then Finn Morgan arrived. The young journalist, with tousled hair and dusty shoes, didn't express emotions. He simply left a folder, copies of forged contracts, statements from a former accountant, and a power of attorney Charles had signed behind Silas's back to legitimize the land seizure. "She didn't deceive anyone," Finn stated succinctly. "The deceiver is dead, and those alive are guarding that secret." Amos said nothing. That evening he sat at his kitchen table, the light casting shadows on his lined face. Mildred, after setting down a cup of tea, looked him straight in the eye. "You once swore an oath for justice, and justice doesn't align with rumors." The next morning, Sheriff Amos adjusted his hat, pinned on his badge, and knocked on the door of the Whitmore farm. Not to interrogate, but to listen. Clara opened the door. Her eyes still showed traces of fatigue, but this time there was no fear. For the first time, someone in uniform stood on the side of truth, and Clara, after everything, no longer wanted to be merely protected. A few days later, she returned to the police station. This time, her steps were resolute, her gaze unwavering. She didn't just bring Finn's documents, but also a thick file of evidence she had gathered herself. Photos from the day of Charles's accident, threatening messages from Beatrice, testimony from a former housekeeper whom she had located through a network of abused women in a charity group. Several voice recordings extracted from voicemails she had kept as her only escape from previous silence. She held her head high, looking directly at Amos. "I can't let my son grow up thinking his mother gave up. I won't let others rewrite my story with lies. From this moment on, I will fight for my truth." Amos looked at Clara for a long time. Then he nodded, not out of pity, but out of respect. This time, Clara didn't come to ask for permission. She came to reclaim the truth with her own hands. That evening, Silas sat alone in the living room. The room was dark, lit only by the flickering light of an oil lamp. In his hands was an old photograph, Emily and little Annie, smiling on a sunny day. Behind the glass frame was a world he hadn't dared to revisit for 6 years. Silas looked at the photo, speaking softly to himself. "Can I help her and her son? I've taken on the role of Elliot's father. Would that make you and our daughter sad?" He sighed, eyes fixed on the frame. "But I can't turn away when I see someone falling as I once did." Silas closed his eyes, and from deep within, something like a warm breeze seeped into his heart, as if Emily was there, smiling, as if he heard his little daughter's voice. "You're not alone anymore, are you, Dad?" One afternoon, as soft sunlight bathed the farmhouse porch, a gentle breeze rustled through the dry grass, carrying the scent of aged wood and morning hay. Clara was gathering laundry from the clothesline, her hands still damp with soapy water, when the distant hum of the mail truck echoed from the dirt road's bend. She stepped out, moving with habitual grace. The weathered wooden mailbox creaked as she opened it. Inside were crumpled advertisements, a water bill, and amidst them a thick envelope sealed with a deep red wax, bearing the seal of the Shady Valley County Court. Clara retrieved the letter, her gaze fixed on the dried red stamp. The wind ceased. The world seemed to pause. Her hands trembled as she tore along the paper's edge. The bold printed words cut deep. Petition for custody of Elliot Bennett, filed by Vivian Whitmore, mother of the late Charles Whitmore. Grounds: Clara Bennett deemed unfit to provide a stable environment for the child. Clara stood motionless in the sunlight, her face pale. She clenched the letter, then quietly turned back into the house. In the living room, Elliot lay asleep on the sofa, cheeks flushed from an unfinished nap. One small foot peeked from beneath a light blanket. Beside him, a glass of milk had cooled, and a coloring book lay open, crayons scattered. Clara said nothing. She gently sat beside her son, cradling him as if he might vanish without her embrace. She lowered her head, pressing her lips to his forehead, her hands trembling, shoulders tense. "I've been running all my life. But this time," she whispered, voice choked, "I won't back down." She placed a hand over her heart, feeling a steady rhythm, not of panic, but resolve. She was no longer the woman abandoned by the roadside. This time, she would fight. From the doorway, Silas watched silently. He had just returned from the stables, his coat dusty, leather gloves in hand. He didn't speak. He observed mother and child, his eyes reflecting something both old and profoundly new. Then he stepped inside, his gaze briefly resting on the opened letter on the table. In that silent room, no words were exchanged. But in Silas's eyes, in Clara's held breath, and in Elliot's small embrace, something had begun to shift. No one would fall again, and no one would stand alone. The courtroom battle days later, at the Shady Valley County Courthouse, Clara appeared with her hair neatly tied, her face composed, eyes clear, not from confidence, but for the first time, armed with truth. Across the courtroom, Beatrice sat in a grey suit, lips painted a muted shade, posture rigid as if commanding the stage. Behind her sat Percy Langston, clad in an expensive suit, leaning on a silver cane, his gaze smug. The plaintiff's attorney began with familiar accusations. Clara lacked a permanent residence, held no steady employment, had a history of instability, and cohabited with a man of undefined legal standing, reckless and irresponsible for a child. Clara did not shed a tear. She stood, presenting evidence meticulously gathered over sleepless nights, a psychological evaluation confirming her stability, Elliot's comprehensive medical records, handwritten journals detailing daily routines, meals, and nights spent nursing fevers, letters from former teachers attesting to her unwavering presence at every parent-teacher meeting. She spoke little, but her voice was firm. "If being a mother means refusing to run, I've done that. If it means standing by your child when no one else will, I've done that too. And if it means never letting go, even when deemed unworthy, I have never let go." Then came Finn Morgan. The young journalist stood, investigative notebook in hand. He requested to expand the discussion beyond finances, to matters of criminal and ethical concern. Finn presented evidence that cast a heavy silence over the courtroom. Charles Whitmore's accident report, vehicle speed exceeding 110 miles per hour, no brake marks. Phone logs revealing a heated argument with a mistress, not Clara, preceding the crash. Manipulative recordings intended to frame Clara in the event of his death. Testimonies from a former housekeeper about Beatrice's orders to exclude Clara from the will, change safe combinations, and destroy Charles's letters. Fraudulent land contracts showing Percy and Charles's scheme to defraud Silas of 40 acres with Beatrice's complicity. Audio recordings of Beatrice instructing staff, "Once Clara loses custody, I'll reclaim everything rightfully ours." The courtroom was stunned. Beatrice turned pale. Percy began to sweat. Silas looked at Clara with a newfound respect. When Silas took the stand, the room held its breath. He needed no introduction. Silas Whitmore, heir to a vast agricultural empire, had withdrawn from public life after personal tragedy. He approached with steady steps, dressed modestly, exuding the aura of a man who had built everything with his own hands and heart. He addressed the judge directly. "I am Silas Whitmore, legal owner of a 2,400-acre ranch in Red Mesa, debt-free, with assets exceeding $30 million. A murmur spread through the courtroom. "But I'm not here because of wealth. I'm here for a boy named Elliot, who once called me Uncle, and one day, Dad. I haven't replaced anyone. I haven't forced anything. I've simply done what a father should, protect a child from those unworthy. The plaintiffs claim Clara Bennett is unfit. Based on what? They are the ones guilty of financial fraud, contract manipulation, and attempts to strip a single mother of her rights. Clara may lack wealth, but she possesses courage and kindness I've not seen in years. Elliot called me Dad. I don't need legal validation for that, but today I demand justice to be rightfully served." Finn Morgan handed over federal investigative documents to the defense attorney, revealing Percy Langston's use of Charles Whitmore's trust funds for money laundering through third-party assets, including the land stolen from Silas. Government representatives confirmed Percy faced federal charges for financial fraud, 18 U.S. Code Section 1343, forgery of notarized documents, concealment of assets in civil disputes, conspiracy to manipulate inheritance assets. Finally, Mildred, the sheriff's wife, stood without notes, speaking from the heart. "Clara survived not by luck, but through kindness. I've never seen anyone hold on to their child with such determination. If Clara isn't deemed fit to be a mother, then no one is." After considering all testimonies, the judge delivered the verdict without lengthy deliberation. The court rules, Clara Bennett shall remain the sole legal guardian of Elliot Bennett. Mr. Silas Whitmore, possessing the requisite financial stability, moral character, and responsibility, is recognized as the legal stepfather. The plaintiff's petition is entirely dismissed. State and federal authorities will continue criminal investigations into Mr. Percy Langston and associated parties. Beatrice and Vivian Whitmore were stunned, their faces drained of color. Percy was immediately handcuffed by federal agents, his escape plans thwarted. Everything Beatrice and Percy had orchestrated now served as evidence against them. The courtroom fell into a profound silence, as if the entire world held its breath. Then, Clara collapsed. Before her knees could meet the cold wooden floor, Silas surged forward, catching her in his arms. His strong arm wrapped around her back, while his large hand gently cradled the nape of her neck, as if afraid she might vanish. She hadn't fainted. She exhaled deeply, her body releasing the weight of years of burden. Clara looked up at Silas, her eyes rimmed with red but dry. For the first time, her gaze held no fear, no defense, only the raw vulnerability of a woman who had returned from the brink. I did it," she whispered, her voice trembling with a soft, almost tearful laugh. "I didn't give up. For the first time in my life, I stood up for myself, for Elliot." Silas said nothing. He offered a slight nod, his hand gently squeezing her shoulder. This man had never made grand promises, yet he had always been there, steadfast, present, trustworthy. Clara placed her hand over his heart, her voice quivering. "Thank you. Without you, my son and I wouldn't be standing here. You didn't just save our lives. You revived the part of me I thought was lost." She rested her forehead against his shoulder, allowing herself to be vulnerable, not out of fear, but because she finally felt safe. The courtroom remained silent, not out of shock, but out of profound respect. This was no longer merely a legal proceeding. It was the moment a single mother reclaimed her life, her dignity, and her chance to love again. From the back row, Elliot sprinted toward them. Silas released one arm to embrace the boy. The three of them held each other tightly, surrounded by silent onlookers. Not out of pity, but out of honor. In that room, no one doubted. She was a mother. He was a father. And together, they were a real family. The trial had concluded, but for this family, it was just the beginning. In a world that had once been cold, warm hearts endured, and through them, people rediscovered themselves. Not as characters in a tragedy, but as living testaments to the most beautiful truth: rebirth. That afternoon, as the court proceedings concluded, a gentle rain began to fall, its scent mingling with the aroma of wild grass, as if cleansing the remnants of a past chapter. On the drive back, Clara remained silent. But it wasn't the silence of worry. Motherhood had once made her vigilant, bowed her head, and taught her to avoid confrontation. Now, she sat beside Silas, her back straight, eyes gazing out the window, her hand firmly holding Elliot's small one as he slept peacefully on her lap. This silence felt like a newfound peace. Upon returning to the farm, dinner was prepared not out of obligation, but from a place of sharing. Silas wiped down the stove, Elliot washed the vegetables, and Clara stood at the stove, sautéing the meal. For the first time, she didn't hide her emotions when looking at Silas. Her gaze was direct, unguarded, and sincere, the look of a woman who had learned to live authentically. After dinner, Silas emerged from the kitchen holding 2 glasses of red wine, a light cashmere sweater draped over his shoulders. He handed 1 glass to Clara, his eyes calm and steady. Not to get drunk, just to remember, we're still alive. Clara accepted the glass, but didn't drink. She looked at him, deeply, directly, without barriers. I used to think love was a luxury, like beautiful houses or dresses I never dared to touch. She took a breath, her voice softening. But it turns out, true love doesn't come from someone who has something to offer, but from someone willing to sit beside you when you have nothing. Silas set his glass down on the windowsill, nodding gently. I have everything: land, shares, cars in the garage, no shortage of money. But for 6 years, I've lived in a 4,000 square foot house where no one asked if I'd eaten that day. He turned back to Clara, his tone sincere. I don't need someone to take care of me. I need someone with whom I can be real. And since you arrived, this house, for the first time, feels truly alive. Clara tightened her grip on the wine glass, her eyes beginning to glisten. Not from the wine, but because she'd never heard a man speak of her presence in such a way. Not as someone needing help, but as someone worthy of being there, just as she was. I'm afraid of love, because love is where people can hurt each other the most. But now I understand. True love isn't about finding someone perfect. It's about finding someone who can sit beside you when you're broken and not walk away. Silas stepped closer, unhurried, without fanfare. He extended his hand, a calm, steady gesture, not as a proposal, but as a silent promise. Clara looked at his hand. For the first time, she didn't retreat. She placed her hand in his, and a sense of safety washed over her, not because of money or status, but because, for the first time, she felt she didn't have to strive to be loved. They sat down on the dark leather chair near the fireplace, together. There was no kiss, no music. Just a gentle spring evening, the crackling of wood, and 2 people, once having lost everything, now finding solace in each other. Clara rested her head on Silas's shoulder, her voice a whisper. The first time she dared to live truthfully. You didn't save me. You reminded me that I deserved to keep living. Silas gently squeezed her shoulder, his gaze softening. And you made me believe this house doesn't need another expensive painting. It needs laughter. And someone to light the lamp before dinner. A few weeks later, as the storm subsided, Silas quietly drove Clara and Elliot away from the farm, along a winding path leading up the hill behind the old pine trees. At the highest point lay a small, serene cemetery, where two white stone graves rested side by side, Emily Whitmore and little Annie. The wild grass had been trimmed by Silas. A fresh bouquet of wildflowers, still dewy, had been placed there. Silas knelt before the tombstone, removing his hat. He didn't cry. He simply gazed long at the engraved names, as if speaking with his soul rather than words. Then he placed his hand on the stone, his voice choked yet steady. "I've found someone worthy, Emily. Someone brave, who doesn't give up, who isn't pretentious. Someone I can place your hand into hers, and you won't have to worry from afar anymore." Clara stood silently, but for the first time, she didn't feel she was standing before a grand past, requiring reverence, but rather being welcomed, not as a rescued victim, but as a companion, invited into another's life through her own strength. Silas turned back, stepped in front of her, and didn't kneel. He simply opened his palm. Inside was a simple, elegant platinum ring, brand new. The old ring I left on Emily's hand, because that was a promise for days gone by. And this is for the days to come. If you're ready. Clara nodded, saying nothing, but her eyes conveyed 1,000 words. I'm ready. Not because I'm loved, but because I want to love again. Then, Clara stepped forward. She stood before the tombstone, holding Elliot's hand tightly. A gentle breeze rustled through the pine trees behind, the scent of lavender blending with the soft afternoon sunlight. Clara bowed her head, her voice unwavering, as firm as stone. I know. I can't replace you. But if you're watching from somewhere, I hope you're at peace. I won't erase Silas and Annie's memories. I'll just be there for him, when he needs a shoulder to lean on. And I'll stand by him to protect Elliot for the rest of our lives. Elliot squeezed his mother's hand. He looked at the small photo engraved on the tombstone, a little girl smiling brightly with her parents, and whispered, "I'll take good care of Dad. He won't be lonely anymore, Mom." Their wedding took place in the small garden behind the farm, where spring had turned even the once barren land green. Ruby May picked flowers, Mildred baked the cake, Finn Morgan handled the photography, and Elliot, in a custom-made little suit, ran around, reminding guests to keep their seats, checking the wedding cake, and neatly arranging the storybooks he had made to gift each guest. "Today, my mum is marrying Dad Silas," Elliot shouted in the garden. "I officially have a family like the ones in stories. But this is a real story." Clara looked at her son, tears quietly streaming down her face. Not from emotion, but from something mending within her heart. For the first time in her life, she saw herself as a happy woman. The ceremony was officiated by Reverend Elijah Burns, the town's elderly pastor, with silver hair and gentle eyes. He placed his hands on their heads, his voice warm and steady. No one lives forever in the past, but those who know how to move forward with gratitude always have a peaceful place to return to. Today, you are not marrying to begin, but to continue, with what your hearts have long understood. One late afternoon, while Clara was weeding the garden, Beatrice Whitmore arrived, her dress wrinkled, eyes sunken, steps unsteady. No bodyguards, no sunglasses, just a worn-out woman facing the past she had once darkened with her own hands. "I was wrong," she murmured. "I was jealous of you, of how Charles looked at you. And I let envy make me cruel. I'm sorry for pushing you and your son out of the life that should have belonged to you two. Aunt Vivian Whitmore also sends her apologies. She feels unworthy to face you and your son, but she hopes for your forgiveness. Clara remained silent. Elliot stood beside his mother, clutching her shirt hem. After a long pause, Clara nodded, not to forgive the past, but to release the final burden in her heart. A few weeks later, Percy Langston was sentenced to 5 years in prison for financial fraud, contract manipulation, and defamation of innocent citizens. As he was handcuffed and led out of the courthouse, the entire town stood outside. No one spoke, no one laughed. Only indifference remained, as if evil no longer had a place to cling to. One morning, Elsie Tate, the owner of the old tailor shop, knocked on the door, holding a roll of hand-embroidered fabric, placing it on Clara's table. No words of apology, but her eyes, softened for the first time. In them, a silent, sincere apology, from someone who had learned remorse. Clara smiled gently. I'm grateful. Not because people have changed, but because I'm no longer defined by the past. 2 years later, the Whitmore farm, now affectionately called Sunrise Ranch, glowed under the June sun. The red brick house no longer felt empty. Every morning, laughter echoed from the kitchen, the sizzle of oil in the pan, and tiny footsteps running through the hallways. In a classroom converted from an old tool shed, Clara, in a simple long dress, her hair neatly tied, wrote the first letters on the blackboard. In front of her sat nearly 20 children, mostly from working-class families in the area or kids who had never had proper schooling. She turned around, smiling kindly. Today, we'll learn letters, but more importantly, we'll learn how to stand up, even after a fall. Every afternoon, Clara wrote in the classroom journal, not for reports, but to remember that she had once been lifted up, and now she was the one extending a hand. Elliot, now 10, sat in the living room, focused on typing on the old laptop Finn Morgan had sent. His latest short story was titled, "The Man Who Planted Grass But Grew a Family." He printed it out, tucked it into a folder, and handed it to his mother. I want Dad Silas to read it first. He's the main character. Silas, now officially Elliot's father and Clara's husband, walked in from the backyard, cradling a sleeping baby girl in his arms. Her name was Grace. Silas hadn't chosen the name by chance. It was a promise to Emily, his late wife, that he would live on, not just exist. Grace was a gift from the past, sent into the future. A soft punctuation mark at the end of a sentence filled with sorrow. Grace had Emily's ash-grey eyes, Clara's determined brow, and a tiny pursed mouth that seemed to hold both their spirits. Clara often joked, she's the bridge between the two women you've loved and will always love. Ruby May, the 17-year-old who had once helped Clara care for Elliot during their early days at the ranch, had been accepted into Texas State University's agricultural program, majoring in applied herbal studies. The day she received her acceptance letter, she ran home, sobbing into Clara's arms. I did it, because you believed in me. Mildred hugged them both, eyes misty, just like Clara once did, when no one believed in her. One crisp morning, Silas stood under the porch, Grace nestled in his arms, watching Clara hang the sign, Whitmore Community School, on the wooden gate. He turned to his daughter. You know, your mum is the strongest woman I've ever met, not because she's fearless, but because she faces her fears and forgives. Grace cooed softly in her sleep. Elliot dashed out, clutching a stack of stories. Dad, Mom, I think I'll enter my story in a contest. Finn says, writing from the heart is enough. Clara embraced her son. Silas wrapped his arms around them both, and there, beneath the golden western sun, a once broken family stood stronger than ever. Time passed, but it didn't erase what was real. Each person in that story bore their scars, choosing to live with them as cherished parts of their journey. And from old wounds, a new world was rewritten, with kindness and truth. Life never promises us fairness, but it always offers us the choice to decide how we rise after being knocked down. Clara Bennett was once a shadow of herself, a single mother, wounded, slandered, cast out from the home she once called family. But instead of collapsing, she stood tall. Not out of vengeance, but with resilience. Not to defeat anyone, but to save herself and her son. Silas Whitmore, a wealthy man haunted by his past, once convinced that love only happens once in a lifetime, opened his heart again. Not because he needed someone to fill his house, but because he needed a reason to live without guilt. Elliot, a boy once found unconscious on the roadside under the scorching sun, grew up surrounded by love, light, and the belief that family isn't where you're born, but where you choose to walk together. Those who sowed pain faced consequences. Those who repented found forgiveness. And those who remained kind, even when misunderstood and abandoned, were ultimately rewarded with something more precious than justice: rebirth. This world isn't short on darkness, but if you're kind, honest, and brave, even if it takes time, light will come. And when it does, it doesn't just illuminate your life. It guides others who are lost. You thought the story was over? But truly, stories of kindness never end. They live on in the way a child grows up and writes letters to their mother, in the way a family, once broken, still sits together at dawn. 10 years later, a letter from Elliot to Mom. May 12th, my 28th birthday, at Sunfield Farm, the room with the east-facing window where you always placed a lavender pot each morning. Dear Mum, today, I sit here, watching sunlight stream through the sheer curtains, the scent of waffles wafting up from the kitchen below, just like in my childhood. My wife is brewing coffee, little Clara is practicing her spelling, and you're still you, the first woman who taught me. Family isn't where you're born, it's where you're loved right. I'm not writing this letter for a special occasion. I'm writing because, after all these years, there's still so much I want to say. Things I was too young to understand back then, and too hesitant to express once I did. I remember, when I was 8, people called you a burden, a homewrecker, a dangerous woman to avoid. They looked at you as if you were a stain, and me, the consequence of a mistake. They didn't know. It was their prejudice that nearly destroyed us. You didn't fight back. You didn't shout. You just held me close, wiped away my fevers, cleaned every corner of that unfamiliar house with blistered hands, and still said, "I'm okay, as long as you're breathing." Back then, I didn't understand why you didn't defend yourself. Now I do. You didn't need to raise your voice because you chose kindness. And kind people don't need to scream to be heard. As I grew up and went to school, I was still the son of the woman who lost custody, who once lay on the roadside like a beggar. But I wasn't ashamed, because at home I saw you teaching me to spell with old books, mending torn shirts with a broken needle, cooking porridge from garden-dug yams. And still smiling. You used to say, "We may lack many things, but we're never short on character." At 18, I got into college to study literature. You sold your old sewing machine, the only wedding gift you had left, to buy me a second-hand laptop. You said, "Don't write my life as a tragedy. Write it as proof." You didn't want pity. You wanted to be seen as someone who stood up and chose to love again, when you had every right to hate the world. I did as you asked, and today, at the 10-year reunion of the Whitmore Community School, I stood and read the first essay I ever wrote about you. My mother was a woman, cast out from a kind world, but she built a kinder one in return. There, children once overlooked learned to read, to write, and to believe they were never anyone's mistake. Mum, Grace, my little sister, is now 10. She's even more mischievous and clever than I was. But whenever I ask, "Who do you love most?" she always hugs your neck and says, "Mum, because you're a superhero. You saved the world, and our family too." I just smile, because even in her simple words, she's right. You did save the world, at least our world, mine, Silas's, and all the children once abandoned who now learn under the roof of your community school. Mum, I was once a child left on the roadside, but today I'm a man standing in the sun, head held high. All thanks to you. I used to fear losing you, afraid someone would take you away, like they once tried. But now, I'm no longer afraid, because you taught me something no one can ever take: self-respect, kindness, and the courage to not become a victim, even when hurt. Dear Mom, if there's one last thing I want to say in this letter, it's this. Thank you, not just for being my mother, but for being the kind soul who still believes that truth always finds its voice. If someone asks me who I aspire to be, I won't hesitate. I'll answer, I want to be a mother like mine, even though I'm a man. Your son, the one you saved with your very life, and now just wants to live worthy of that love. Elliot Bennett Whitmore, the one who bears your name and is proud of it. Elliot folded the letter and placed it in a small wooden frame beside his desk, next to a photo of his mother, smiling in the sunlight. Outside, Clara sat on an old wooden bench, knitting a scarf for the coming winter. Silas held a cup of hot tea, sitting beside her. The little house, once a shelter, was now a true home. No one mentioned the courtroom. No one spoke of the past. But in each heart, there was something never forgotten. Kindness had saved them. Resilience had guided them. And truth, though once buried, had finally been spoken. And if you, reading this now, still listen, still feel moved, still sit in silence because something within you resonates, then perhaps you are the very person this story was meant for. If you've ever cried unseen, if you've ever fallen without a hand to catch you, if you've ever stayed silent because there was no one left to trust, then please don't leave quietly. Share this story, not because it's well written, but because it's real. Not to tell Clara's tale, but to remind yourself that we've all been a Clara, fragile, exhausted, yet still striving forward. If you have a story yet untold, send it out. Even if it's just a few lines, a scar, a fear, I will listen. Not to judge, but to walk with you. Because perhaps you, with all you've kept hidden, are the very light someone lost in darkness needs. And if today you no longer have the strength to say, I'm okay, then let me, or anyone touched by this story, say it for you. You're not alone. You're not wrong.